Thanks, everybody. All right, wow, great. I have a pretty loud voice, so, and in fact, many years ago, I think I blew out the system here. So watch it. Yeah, thanks for that intro, and it's great to be here at A.R.E., see all these people that I know and have seen before, including John Van Auken and Robert and Katie and my old friend Andrew Collins. All of you guys, I recognize many of you too. Like you, I've always been interested in ancient civilizations, Atlantis, reincarnation, Edgar Cayce readings. For me, Vimana's ancient technology, the Great Pyramid. I'm interested in Bigfoot and stuff on Mars and Tesla and all that. Tonight, I'm going to run through a wide spectrum of things. We'll start out by talking about megaliths and stuff, and then we'll get into Tesla. I'm wearing my Nikola Tesla t-shirt. And then we'll go to the Mars and the Moon. So I just want to tell you just briefly a little bit about myself beyond that bio. I was born in France, but my parents are Americans. My mom was from Connecticut and New York. My father's from Colorado. And my parents liked to travel, and so I was fortunate. I traveled a lot as a little kid and went to Stonehenge and the pyramids of Mexico, and we went to Italy and Turkey and Greece and stuff, and grew up in a strong diet of Johnny Quest cartoons and Star Trek and Lost in Space and The Man from U.N.C.L.E., all that stuff. And later the Star Wars movies, those are great. And I started writing books in the mid-'80s. My first book was actually a book called A Hitchhiker's Guide to Africa and Arabia. And the publisher, this was in Chicago Review Press, and I was so excited about my book coming out. This was like 1984 or something. And the publisher said to me, well, kid, don't quit your day job. And besides, it's not authors that make the money, he said, it's publishers. So I was like, oh, okay, well, I'll be a publisher then. So that's what happened. And so now I've been on the Ancient Alien show, which started in 2008. What created Ancient Aliens was actually the movie Indiana Jones and the Crystal Skull. That's really where Ancient Aliens came out of that movie. And so now, since I've been on that show, people will recognize me at airports. And they'll come up to me and they'll say, aren't you that guy on that Ancient Alien show? And I'll say, yeah. And then they'll say, well, can I ask you a question? And I'll say, yeah, go ahead. And they'll typically say to me, what's with that guy's hair? And Giorgio's a great guy and a good friend. And I've known Giorgio from before Ancient Aliens, by the way, and Eric Van Doniken. So my interests are wide and varied, and one of the things that I'm very interested in is megaliths, and the bigger the better. So yeah, let's now talk about the largest known megaliths in the world, and they are at Baalbek in Lebanon. That is right near the Syrian border. It's a kind of a dangerous area to go to right now, and off and on you can kind of go there and whatnot. There's a friend of mine, Ralph Ellis. He's a British pilot. He's there standing at one of these megaliths. They weigh up to 1,000 tons, and it's only been recently that they uncovered this one. And this is now the largest known hewn block ever, but it was never put into place. 1,650 tons. I mean, this is massively huge. And whenever you get any type of megalith really that's in a way over 20 tons, we're already looking at pretty big and heavy blocks of stone. When you get stones that are 80 tons or 100 tons, you're really looking at a massive block of stone that's going to be extremely difficult to move. And when you get up to 1,000 tons or more, I mean, you're really looking at megaliths that can't even be moved by modern cranes and things. The largest cranes are stationary cranes in ports and stuff, and they some of them can barely lift weights of this. So this begs the question of like, well, why are you trying to build with such large stones? And that is, I maintain, you need to have really levitation, anti-gravity. I mean, you're making these stones weightless, and what would appear to be so difficult must be actually easy for them. What you have at Baalbek, too, mainstream archaeologists say, well, Baalbek is a Roman ruin. It's a Roman structure built by the Romans. And there are Roman ruins on top of this giant platform, which is earlier than Romans. And it's so, as Robert Chalk was mentioning too earlier, how you have structures on top of older structures. And this is what we have all over the world, including at Baalbek. And in fact, what we have at Baalbek, this platform with other ancient structures on top of it, we have that at Jerusalem too. And this is what we're looking at here, is the Israelis only really in the last 15, 20 years, they cut a tunnel into what would be the going left from what's known as the Wailing Wall in Jerusalem. This is King Solomon's temple, and today's called the Wailing Wall. And we couldn't see what was in there until the Israelis cut this tunnel through rocks and a bunch of old buildings. And what they found was what's similar to Baalbek, and that is this gigantic block right here. And the girl is standing here. It's so big that we don't know how big it is. We don't know how deep it is, so we don't know really the entire size or weight of this. But it's perfectly fitted together. There are other smaller blocks here, then these cuts and things like that. I mean, this is also pre-Jerusalem kind of structure. So it shows that other places like Baalbek, we have other temples and things that are built onto these gigantically huge stones. My latest book is about obelisks, and I'm particularly interested in obelisks, and we'll get into that also later in the show. What's interesting here is that many megaliths and ancient structures are actually underwater. And this is actually something new. This is right off the coast of Sicily, and it is a fallen obelisk. It's in about 40 feet of water. It was also just recently discovered a few years ago. There's over 200 known sunken cities in the Mediterranean. And all over the world, I'm a scuba diver as well. So diving at sunken cities, looking at these things. So once again, when you have structures like this and obelisks and things that are underwater, they can be up to, say, 10,000 years old. At the end of the last ice age, they're saying that ocean levels were 300 to 400 feet lower than they are today. So just as in ancient times, as in modern times, cities are often built where rivers are coming down and meet the ocean. So if somebody was building a city, say 12, 15,000 years ago, and if they built it where a river was meeting the ocean, that city today would be 300 to 400 feet underwater. And you cannot scuba dive to those depths either. And you would need to go down in a bathysphere or a submarine or something like that. This is an aerial photo of the unfinished obelisk in Egypt, in Aswan. And it is also a gigantically huge monolith. It weighs around 1,000 tons. Your average obelisk weighs about 500 tons, which is plenty big. The unfinished obelisk is important, and lots of tourists see it. If you go to Aswan, they're likely to take you to see it. What happened with the unfinished obelisk was they were quarrying this obelisk and trenching along the sides, cutting it out, and then you have to cut underneath it and then ultimately bring the obelisk out of the bedrock that is the quarry, which is difficult enough, and then you have to move it, and then you're going to erect it. What happened in the case of the unfinished obelisk was, as they were cutting underneath the obelisk getting ready to extract it, they noticed there was a natural crack in the granite that they hadn't seen before. And so once they saw that crack, they stopped all work on the obelisk, because the obelisk had to be perfect. It's granite, a very fine type of granite. Granite is infused with quartz crystals. But once they saw that crack, they knew we can't use this obelisk. All work completely stopped, and they're like, okay, sorry, we got to start again and do another obelisk. So it's interesting too, and I'll get more into this later. Egyptologists do not really have an explanation for obelisks and what their purpose was. I mean, it's a huge construction project to quarry, remove from the quarry, to move an obelisk, then to stand it up. It's a big deal. They're weighing at least 500 tons. But Egyptologists don't know why. There's no real purpose for them. Egyptologists say that obelisks represent a ray of the sun. I mean, they're just a symbolic ray of the sun. That's it. Typically, temples in Egypt were thought to have two obelisks typically in front of them. At the very least, an obelisk is like a giant acupuncture needle for the earth. At the very least. So we'll get into that a little bit more. This is my latest book, came out just in June, Obelisks, Towers of Power. I've been interested in obelisks for many, many years, and later in the presentation, we'll get more into this. I've always been interested in Atlantis, Mu, lost continents, all those things. I was always very interested in the Edgar Cayce readings about Atlantis. I've probably read most of those. Atlantis was said to be from over 10,000 years ago. It was a giant city with concentric circles, a huge navy. It was supposedly out in the Atlantic, beyond the Pillars of Hercules. There was supposed to be a big mountain to the north of Atlantis. It had huge fleets of ships. Allegedly, as in the Cayce readings, they had airships too, Vimanas, Velixes, that kind of a thing. And I'm a believer in all that. And the Atlantis story too, we get it from Plato, but it's really coming from the Egyptians. And Plato's uncle Solon was a statesman. He went to Egypt, and at the temple of Cayce in Egypt, he was told by them, the Egyptian priests told him, they said, yes, you Greeks, you don't even know your own history. Greece is a much older country than you even know. And then they tell him the story of Atlantis. And that Greece even fought a war with Atlantis at one point. I love to travel. I spent years actually in India, Nepal, and through Southeast Asia, also in Africa. The Tamils of southern India, they believe in this lost continent called Kumari Kandam, stretching through Sri Lanka down into Australia and all that. And they're finding evidence of this. There's also the famous city of Dwaraka, which is up here in Gujarat. It's underwater. That's the city that Krishna supposedly is from. So let's go now to South America. And Peru and Bolivia, I love South America. It's the land of mystery and megaliths. This is Ollantaytambo. It is in the Sacred Valley. It's between Cuzco and Machu Picchu. You would typically go here on your way to Machu Picchu. This is an amazing site. Tourists come here, they see this wall, they call it a sun temple, this wall of these 7 megaliths, but there's all these huge blocks of granite perfectly fitted all around it. And what you see when you get up there, it's on top of a cliff ridge. And there's a ramp coming down one side on the back of this, but all around here it's actually cliffs. But this is exactly as it looks today, these huge blocks of granite finely cut. And what you find here as well is what are called keystone cuts. Keystone cuts are T-shaped or hourglass-shaped cuts like this into a block. And there's going to be another T-shaped cut like this on another block corresponding to it. It's got to be on a flat horizontal plane. And then they actually pour molten metals into it, and it becomes a clamp or a cramp that's one metal piece that's spanning the two blocks. And so it's an unusual way of fitting blocks together, and you're using molten metals as well. Now, but it has to be on a flat plane. It's not going to work otherwise. But as you go around the corner in Ollantaytambo, whoops, sorry, go back. Here's this clamp here. Okay, it's one of those. It's a keystone cut actually, but it's on a vertical wall. So what that means is this block is not where it should be. It's been reused by something else, and you have this crummy little wall right in here. Mainstream archaeologists are saying, oh yeah, the Incas did all this. They just dragged these giant blocks up and then filled it in with these crummy blocks. They put a little cut there. No, I mean, this is clearly being reused. The Incas are reusing these sites. They're indestructible. These are the stairs going up to Ollantaytambo. You see these unusual knobs and things like that. You see the lichen patches here, which are quite large. Perfectly fitted together, granite blocks. I mean, this is really very exquisite architecture. Here's Machu Picchu, fantastic place. It's really today the most popular tourist site in South America. It's a megalithic city. It's a secret city up on top of a mountain. It's in a spectacular spot, and it's just well worth seeing. And it is a megalithic city. This is an aerial photo of Lake Titicaca. Cusco is just to the north of this. Lake Titicaca is at a higher altitude. It's at almost 13,000 feet. This part of Lake Titicaca, half of Lake Titicaca is in Bolivia, the other half's in Peru. This part of Lake Titicaca is very, very deep. It's about 800 feet deep in this part. This area is Bolivia down here. This is what they call the lesser little Lake Titicaca. And it's much more shallow in this area, and according to Bolivian archaeologists that I've talked to, they think there's a bunch of sunken cities here. Also, Lake Titicaca has a lot of UFO activity, and UFOs are seen coming up out of the lake late at night, and it's a very common thing to see there, UFOs. And all of South America is quite a hotbed of UFO activity, really. What's very strange about Lake Titicaca is that there are seahorses in Lake Titicaca. And that's a geological anomaly, I would say. Seahorses are basically found in tropical reefs, like in Indonesia and places like that, not at 13,000 feet in the Andes. And what that suggests that with seahorses is that Lake Titicaca was at one time at sea level. And then in some cataclysmic changes, pole shift or something like that, the whole thing was lifted up to nearly 13,000 feet in the Andes. There are sunken ruins in Lake Titicaca. It's very difficult to dive in Lake Titicaca because of the high altitude. Their diving expeditions are very specialized there. You have to actually use mixed gases and things to dive at that high altitude. But they do find megalithic ruins in the lake, and the lake's the level of the lake has changed quite a bit over the years. Some years ago, maybe 10 or so, this Italian expedition that was at the island of the Sun, there's some islands in Lake Titicaca, and they claimed that they discovered, while diving, a solid gold obelisk in the water. And that was astonishing to me. I was like, okay. I've not seen photos of that or anything else recently. What else? Just recently I was at this place, the Mokiakta Chulpa in Espinar province. This is near Lake Titicaca. This is a very kind of oddball mushroom-shaped tower. Archaeologists, it's megalithic and perfectly fitted with the dome and everything. The other buildings around it are not megalithic or perfectly fitted, but this thing is. And it seemed like the city itself of Mokiakta is built around this tower. And there are other towers like this too around Lake Titicaca. This is a place called Cotimbo. It is a mesa that's just on the southern shores. It's actually in Peru. You climb up this mesa up here, and there are towers and things up on the top. We'll go on up there. This is what you see when you get up here. Square and round structures, also megalithic towers, perfectly fitted together. And what you find here are, in relief, serpents carved into the rocks. And like Robert was talking about Göbekli Tepe and those animals and things, yeah, to carve these things in relief, they have to have this planned already that they're going to have these serpents on the stones, and they have to cut all the rest of the stone away from it to have that. Whoops, what's going on? Here we go. All right. So here we have that. All right, and so here we have also, again, another one of these serpents is carved in this tower. It's perfectly fitted together. And so what are these towers for? What the archaeologists are saying these towers are for is that they're burial towers and that the people are just putting their dead in there. But what these towers ultimately are, they're part of the metallurgy. They're smelters. Because they're mining gold and copper and silver, mercury, all kinds of metals there. It's a super rich mining area. And you need smelters for that. And that's what these towers are. This is another site, also near Lake Titicaca, called Silistani, and this place called Lake Amayu. It's right there. UFOs are also famously seen coming out of this lake. They come out at like 4 in the morning. I've not personally seen this, but there's a number of lakes around Lake Titicaca itself, this lake, and other lakes where UFOs are said to come out of. So here we go, once again, more of these towers there. Here's the serpents, carved in relief here. So it's unusual. There are other animals too. There are mountain lions, pumas, as they call them in South America, and occasionally a condor or something, kind of similar to Göbekli Tepe in many ways. And when you go to the Yazidi temples in northern Iraq, this is the Kurdish area, and the Kurds are in the news right now from just what's happening in Syria and Turkey. So at temples of the Yazidis, and this goes back to ancient Sumeria, they have the same thing. These serpents are carved on them. Here's one of the temples. So the same thing that we're seeing in Peru, we're seeing in northern Iraq with Sumerians and allegedly the very beginning of civilization. Okay, on the southern side of Lake Titicaca is Tiwanaku, and Pumapunku is right nearby. It's been reconstructed by Bolivian archaeologists. It's an utterly megalithic city. It's a really fantastic place. Those keystone cuts are there, and we'll see them. This is the famous Gate of the Sun. When you go to Tiwanaku, this is one of the things you're certainly going to see, and your guides are going to show you. It's a monolithic doorway. It's been cracked and split. It's been actually re-erected, apparently, at some point. We're not even sure exactly when that was, whether somehow the early Spanish did it. And right in the middle is Viracocha, the sun god. He's got 2 staffs here. He's wearing a big feathered headdress. This is all pre-Inca. And on either side of him are these birdmen. So here we are. So he's standing in the middle with these staffs, and on either side of him are about 20 birdmen, and they're all running towards him. And they have bird faces, they have wings, they're also carrying staffs. You can see that on both sides of the panel. There are these birdmen, they're running towards Viracocha. We don't know why. Archaeologists are stumped about what this is all about, but we might think really that the birdmen are people who fly. Okay. Also, something else to talk about here. Tears are coming down on his cheeks. He's crying. But the tears are the tears of the sun. And the tears of the sun is molten gold, liquid gold. That's what the tears of the sun. He's crying liquid metals. Mainstream archaeologists believe that Tiwanaku was completely wallpapered with gold, just gold, sheets of gold. And when you went to Tiwanaku, you were walking through a city of just golden buildings. But behind them is our granite walls and things. So we have the Olmecs, and we'll talk a little bit more about them. This is an Olmec jade figurine from Costa Rica. He's got a cone head. He's got the elongated head. He's got wings on him. He's a birdman too. He can fly. So here we go. Now, right near to Tiwanaku is Pumapunku. It's actually part of Tiwanaku. In fact, it's about 1 kilometer away. What you have at Pumapunku are huge slabs of sandstone, and then in the back are, just in these rows, are some of the famous H blocks. We'll see them in a minute. Parts of Pumapunku have been destroyed in some tidal wave that came apparently from Lake Titicaca, destroyed the building, put pillars and things on big mud pillars and stuff like that, mud and muck. And once again, we're seeing these keystone cuts and clamps that go in there. So megalithic block, perfectly fitted together, and a clamp. These molten metals are poured into them. It's an unusual way of fitting blocks. At the giant sandstone blocks, too, at Pumapunku, we have more of these keystone cuts. They're cut in there. There will be metals are poured into this. These are huge, too, so there would be large metal clamps. Why you would actually have metal clamps here with these giant blocks? I mean, you wouldn't think they're really going anywhere, these giant metal blocks, but they're still putting these keystone cuts in there. Here are some of the metal clamps that are poured into the blocks to help them fit together. So it's an unusual way. We saw these also at Ollantaytambo, near Machu Picchu. They're also at the Coricancha, the Temple of the Sun in Cusco. So, and you see them a lot here in Pumapunku and in Tiwanaku. So now, these ones are actually in Vietnam at a place called My Son, near to Da Nang. The exact same kind of keystone cuts, the T-shaped cuts. So here we have the same unusual megalithic construction, and this is in basalt, actually, in Vietnam. So this is a CAM building, as it said. So now back to Tiwanaku. This is the museum diorama there at Tiwanaku, and so here they're taking the H blocks here, and they're pouring the molten metal into there. And here are these perfectly cut H blocks. They're very hard granite. They're articulated and cut. I mean, the edges are very sharp. I mean, you would need power tools to make these. And this really shows you, how you go to these museums, and it's a paradox, a dichotomy of these perfect, really high-tech blocks of stone. And they're pouring it, but these guys are over here. They got their campfire, and they're smelting these, the stuff, and you're just like, wait. They're wearing these simple cotton tunics, and so it's like, the sort of hunter-gatherers who are now making these perfect H blocks. But that's how they do it in these museums, and it somehow makes sense to these archaeologists. You wonder. What is near to Pumapunku and Tiwanaku, looking out to the west, and this is a new thing, is this is a pyramid, and it is being looted. It's a pyramid. We tried to go there one time. I've been to the site many times, and our guide, he was an Austrian Bolivian, a mining engineer, in fact, and he pointed this out to us. He said, "Oh yeah, that's this pyramid over here, and there's this village, and it's not an acknowledged archaeological site by the Bolivian government. So the village it's like their own private archaeological site, and they're looting it. They're excavating it themselves." And I tried to get there, and we drove in our minibus that way, and we drove on this dirt road, getting closer. I'm using a telephoto lens to take this photo. But we only got about halfway to the village, and he said, "Oh, we have to stop here. We can't go into that village. They won't let us in there because of what they're doing and excavating." But what happened actually in this village, what happened was a guy, this is in 1960, he was digging out a well or something in his house, and he uncovered this ceramic bowl, and it's quite large, and it is ceramic, and he used it actually to feed his pigs. And a Catholic priest happened to go there in 1960 and saw him doing this, and noticed this bowl and thought, "Oh, this bowl is probably archaeologically important, this bowl." And he negotiated with the guy that the priest would take the bowl, and that the archaeological department in Bolivia would take possession of it. And they traded him a house for it. They got a house, kind of not a really nice house like in America, but he got a house anyway. And here's the thing with this bowl. This bowl has 2 types of Sumerian writing on it. It has Sumerian cuneiform right here, and then it has Sumerian hieroglyphs over here. The Sumerians wrote in cuneiform, and they also wrote in hieroglyphs. So here is Sumerian writing on a bowl in Bolivia, and it is many thousands of years old. So this bowl right here, it's right today, it's in the Gold Museum, Archaeological Museum in La Paz. It's the government museum. It's on display. They tell you not to take photos of it. As soon as the guard, turned his back, we were all like taking pictures. But it's there on display. And this bowl it's an archaeological time bomb. It can't be there. This single artifact right here throws all South American archaeology completely out the window. The idea that North and South America were just isolated from the rest of the world until Columbus and the Spanish discovered North and South America. Yeah, this completely changes all that. Right there, this one thing. All that mainstream archaeologists can do is ignore it. And that's what they do. They just ignore it. You're not going to see this. It was on Ancient Aliens once. But yeah, in my mind, you're not going to see a National Geographic special talking about this bowl. But it's real. And so here we go. There's also another artifact, which is not, it's also in the museum, but they don't have it on display. I have seen it because they brought it out for the Ancient Aliens shoot. And it's called the Pocatilla statue. It's also from that same pyramid that they're excavating. It has Sumerian writing too, which is here. It is on the thigh. It's on both sides of the thigh. This thigh, it's about a 3-4 foot high granite statue. Essentially, it's been broken. And they brought it out and they show it. So this is another thing with Sumerian writing on it. So here are the H blocks. They're very, very hard granite. They're worn, but they're very, very well cut, and they're extremely well articulated. And they apparently all fit in together. They're like a kind of a Lego blocks that are prefabricated. Like I'm saying, the articulation and the cutting on these things is really fancy, but they will fit in together. And so here we go. Let's watch an animation. And this is courtesy of my friend Eric von Däniken. So the H blocks themselves they're like prefabricated, and they fit in together the way they're cut. And so by fitting them together, you can create these walls, and it's almost like some airship Vimana with a prefab CAD programs and everything is coming there, and it is, we're talking about a computer-aided design program. It's spewing out these H blocks, and they fit together, and so that was pretty cool, huh? So, yeah, so that's, you're now looking at some pretty sophisticated stuff here, to say the least. I talk about all this in my book on ancient technology in Peru and Bolivia. Let's now, we'll switch gears a little bit and we'll go to Egypt. This is Serapeum, which is in Saqqara. The Egyptian government had this closed for decades, and I was able to go there in the 80s briefly, and then they closed it for a long time. We got special permission from Zahi Hawass. This is my friend Christopher Dunn. He's been here too. Zahi Hawass gave us permission. This is open now, and you can see it. The last few years, they opened it. So when you go to the Serapeum, it's just desert, flat desert out there. There's no pyramid or anything. But then suddenly you're walking down underground and into this underground world and tunnel system that is the Serapeum. Once you get in there, there's this whole system of tunnels and closets, and in them are these gigantic basalt boxes with lids. They call them sarcophagi. They believe that what the mainstream archaeologists are saying, and these things weigh about 80 tons, The lids weigh about 20 tons. Basalt, extremely hard, heavy rock. And the mainstream archaeological explanation is that these were sarcophagi for mummified bulls, which are called the Apis bulls. And they did find one mummified bull in one of them. But the problem with these is that, this is a screenshot from one of our early videos and stuff. The thing is that there are these little closets, these little alcoves that these giant basalt blocks are in. So somehow they've pushed these super heavy basalt boxes into these little corners. And the way Egyptologists and archaeologists like to explain how they're moving these giant things is that, well, you just get so many hundreds of workers and slaves dragging these things and pushing and pulling and all that, but there's a lot of serious problems with that, as you can imagine, including how they can actually get this. There's just no place for all these people to stand and do things. I mean, and in fact, at one part of the Serapeum, there's a block. Well, one of them is just right in the middle of the passages. And they just kind of left it there, and no one can move it. Not even the modern Egyptians can't move that out of the way or do anything. I mean, it's something. How they would even make these is difficult. I mean, it's super hard. They would have to drill this whole box out. That's a problem too, because Egyptians supposedly only had copper tools, copper drills, copper chisels. And there's a few hieroglyphs on some of them, but even engraving these hieroglyphs would take diamond-tipped tools and drills. It boggles the mind at how they're doing that. And the surfaces are perfectly straight. This is Chris measuring it with his precision tools. He runs a machine shop in Danville, Illinois. You can see some of his precision tools down there. This is the kind of thing he's looking for, that just perfectly straight angles and corners and things like that too. These inside corners, those are things very difficult to do. You can't just bash these things out with a stone hammer or a copper chisel. I mean, this is the problem. I mean, and in fact, to make these things, like the H-blocks and stuff, you would need power tools to do it. So once again, this shows you, what a confined and small area that these boxes are for. So it's a mystery, the Serapeum, even what these things were for. Maybe they were for mummified bulls, but even so, it's just, it's mind-boggling. All right, so one of my subject that I'm well known for is stone balls and spheres, and I've heard that people make fun of me on the internet about this. So in Costa Rica, there's many dozens, perhaps hundreds really, of stone balls. They're made out of granite. They're basically perfectly round. They are man-made. There's no question about it. No one really thinks that they're natural. They're man-made. Some of them are quite large, almost the size of a Volkswagen or something. They're granite. It is said that to make a perfectly round stone sphere like this is one of the more difficult things to do. And once again, you would probably need a CAD, a computer-aided design program to cut this, rather than just bashing this out with a stone hammer in your hand. And they don't really know what they were for. Why are there these huge stone balls? Archaeologists do not have an answer for this. One explanation that I was told that kind of made sense was that they're blanks for these colossal heads or something like that, and they stone ball can be rolled, of course. So, well, there we go. You got to run from these things when they start coming at you. You've got more stone balls here. They actually find them in the jungle, in the southwest part of Costa Rica, right near the coast. And there's an island right off Costa Rica too that has a few of these stone balls on it. It's almost as if some tidal wave just washed these balls up into the jungles, and then they find them. What archaeologists say in Costa Rica is that, well, they were symbols of authority. The chief, when he died, he got a stone ball in his grave, you know. And that's what they do, actually, at the museum. They show you a grave, and they have a stone ball in it, and they say, yeah, this is, you know, what stone balls are for. Yeah, so here they are, you know, excavating them and stuff in Costa Rica. This one was just totally buried. Some cataclysm. I mean, these things can be, these things could be 10,000 years old. I mean, we don't know. You cannot date these, really. In theory, you could do carbon dating, you know, on things that might be at the bottom of the thing, and that give you some idea. So, you know, I got really interested in stone balls and around the world, and because they're not just in Costa Rica. And a guy sent me this. This was a book that was published in like 1918 in Los Angeles, and it's about this trolley that was being built, electric trolley, just, you know, 1910 or something, in Santa Monica. And in order for this trolley to go out towards Pasadena and stuff like that, they had to remove some hills that were in Los Angeles. So they brought this steam shovel out, and the steam shovel started removing all this stuff because the grade of the trolley and the tracks has to be very, very gradual. And so after they did it, they found all these stone balls here. This is Los Angeles. And at the time, what they said was, oh, you know, they're dinosaur eggs. This was, you know, 1910, 1915 or something like that. They don't know what happened to these. They all disappeared. I figure they ended up in people's gardens in Los Angeles and stuff, and they must sort of still be around. So if you go up to the Russian Arctic, Franz Josef Land, which is up near Spitsbergen, remote place, no one really lives up here. Yeah, some cruise ships do get up there, and what do they have here? Some stone balls. Yeah, and in fact, this is one of the things, if you go on a cruise ship to Franz Josef Land, this is sort of what you do. You get out and you go see the stone balls there. And they're granite, and some of them are chipped and stuff, but some apparently are perfectly round. So that's a mystery, what they're doing up there. We just don't know, you know, what's going on here. Again, I think that geologists are trying to say, oh, well, these are natural somehow. I mean, this is the thing. Some stone balls are natural, but others are artificial. And this is another complicating thing with stone balls. Is we know some are man-made, absolutely. But you know, archaeologists and geologists are thinking like, well, we don't know. You know, why would people be up in Franz Josef Land making these things? These are some stone balls in Bosnia. And we went out there. They're in a creek. They're not granite. There was a whole bunch of them in this creek bed, about a dozen or so. And they seemed also to be possibly artificial, although it was hard to tell with them whether they were somehow natural. I just honestly couldn't say. There's a place in Mexico here, Piedras Bola. Now these are thought to be natural somehow, volcanic bombs. And this is, I mean, how can these things be natural? Well, their explanation is that some volcano is spewing out a big blob of lava, and it's going through the air, spinning, and then it gets hard, and then it lands, and it's a stone ball. I mean, so in Siberia, Nazarovo, Siberia, they suddenly they were doing some construction work, and they found a bunch of stone balls up there. These things are big. You know, what these things are all for, we don't know. But people, you know, all over the world, people are kind of getting interested in these stone balls. But again, they just don't have a good explanation for them. What they're for? Why, you know, why all this? This is in New Zealand, the Moraki boulders in New Zealand. Eric had this. This is on the South Island. They're just in the water. They're thought again to be natural somehow, and there's a whole bunch of them there. And they're all washed up. They're a major tourist site on the South Island, and they're on the west coast of the South Island of New Zealand, and a well-known tourist site there. San Augusta, Italy also has a bunch of stone balls there, and they're big. Exactly what they're doing there, nobody's quite sure. Here's some more stone balls. These are ones in Italy as well, and these ones also in Italy. Some more there. We went to a place called Dubrovnik in Croatia. They also had all these stone balls lined up. They were much smaller. And you kind of wonder if they were somehow cannonballs or for catapults or something like that. But no one really has, again, a good explanation for what all these things. Ball bearings, maybe that's somehow they were moving giant megaliths and using these stone balls. We just don't know. Whoops, sorry. Went a little too fast here. Gongxi, Hunan, China. Other little town. This is in southern China, near to Hong Kong. It's kind of Canton area. And this town's famous for its stone balls. Yeah, no. Once again, we just don't know what they're doing there, what the whole story is. Here's one of the stone balls there. It's kind of, I'm not even sure what kind of stone that is. This is Malta. Stone balls at Malta when you go there. So they're a bit smaller, but again, archaeologists just this Malta again, stone balls. So I have to admit, I really do not have a good idea myself. We were in Sardinia, and we went to this one site, and there was this stone ball which is cracked, and it cracked in like a weird yin-yang sort of thing. So stone balls there. And just recently, I was at the Isle of Man just a few months ago, and we found out there was this granite ball in the Isle of Man. It's in the harbor, and at low tide, people go out and there's the famous stone ball of the Isle of Man. Once again, and now, when you go to Easter Island, you also have stone balls there too. And this is Easter Island. This is in the museum. And this is about the size of a volleyball or so, this ball. It's a perfectly round granite ball there on Easter Island. It's in the museum. And when you're on Easter Island, and the first time I went there, I didn't realize this, but the islanders themselves say the most important thing on the entire island of Easter Island is this stone ball. And it's fairly big. It's probably 2.5 feet or maybe 3 feet in diameter. And there's a couple other smaller stone balls around it. They've made a little enclosure. This is on the very north side of the island. A lot of tourists may not see it because it's by itself. You have to almost specifically go to see it. But to the Easter Islanders, they've said this ball is what's important on this island. And the islanders, too, say that Easter Island is the center of the world, or the navel of the earth, your navel, and that this ball is it. That this is why Easter Island's the center of the world, or the navel of the world, because of this stone ball. Cusco is also called that too, the navel of the world. So let's talk a little bit more about Easter Island. Here's the quarry, Ranaraku tree. Easter Island is really kind of a triangle of 3 volcanoes, and then this volcano, which is the quarry, which is sort of in the middle of the island, not exactly. And this is where all the giant statues are quarried. They're, in many cases, they're buried up to their chins. Many of them are, they were quarried, and then they were just moved, a few hundred yards out of the quarry and stood up. The idea was that the statues, they say, the statues were meant to be put around the island, and then inlaid eyes were to be put in the statues, and the statues were to face inland. And what the purpose of the statues, what the Easter Islanders said, was to protect the island and keep it from sinking, because the islanders themselves said, "Oh, we're part of this lost continent called Hiva, H-I-V-A, Hiva." But Hiva's gone now. It's under the waves. It's like the lost continent of Mu or something. But Easter Island is still above the water, and the statues, are here to protect the island. And a power came out of their eyes called mana. And that's a Sanskrit word too. It means like occult energy, mana. And so that's what's happening there with the thing. So here's the volcano the statues come out of. Now get this. See, all these statues here are the statues that came out of the volcano and then were placed around the island, looking inland to protect the island. But here's the strange thing about what the islanders say, is that the statues, as they came out of the quarry here, they had to walk. The statues walked around the island. This is what the islanders say. But they had to walk in a clockwise fashion around the island. So get this. Here's the quarry here. This statue up here, according to them, it couldn't just go from a short distance from here to there. It had to walk completely around the island and walk around this volcano and come around here. This is what the islanders say. Now this area here of this volcano, there's a magnetic anomaly here, and it's on maps. And I hiked around the island, and the first time I was there, and I camped and stuff. And on the maps, it has this magnetic anomaly, and it tells you, yeah, your compass is not going to work correctly in this part of the island. And in fact, Philippe Cousteau, the son of the famous explorer Jacques Cousteau, they went there in the early 80s on the Calypso, their ship, and they had an ultralight plane on the ship. And Philippe Cousteau then wanted to fly up to the volcano up here. And they told him, they said, oh, no, don't fly near this volcano, they said, because there's this magnetic anomaly and all your instruments will go crazy on your ultralight, and it's just very dangerous. And Philippe Cousteau's like, oh, no, I can handle it. He flew his ultralight up there. All the instruments on his ultralight went crazy, and he crashed. And he was almost killed. And they had to medevac him back to Santiago in Chile to save his life, and they did. So there's something going on here, this strong anomalous magnetic field. Apparently it has something to do with moving the statues. So here we are back at the quarry. You can see these guys. This guy's buried up to his nose here, and other ones are here. So you'll see just how big these statues are. This is on the inside of the quarry. There's a lake there that's got Totoro reeds on it, which are the same reeds at Lake Titicaca. You can't go here now that they're keeping you from going to certain parts of Easter Island. But this diagram, again, shows you how large some of these statues are. They're huge. They're really, really big. And they had, later on them, they had top knots put on them. These little top knot hats that have to do with the way long hair, and then which is tied in a top knot. There's a couple of very unusual statues, including this one right here. We're about to see him. He's kneeling. The other guys don't have legs, and Robert Schock was showing those things that Göbekli Tepe, where the little hands, and it is very similar. And there's, so here they are. This guy is different, and he is kneeling down, and he's in a certain position. And this was Thor Heyerdahl, who's also excavated this statue, the Norwegian explorer, was very famous. So here you can see how deeply buried these statues are. I mean, there's even, what is that, 40 feet of dirt and detritus around this thing. So this thing is really old. I mean, even how that much soil would, accumulate around these statues is something. So it does show that these statues are much, much older than probably what mainstream archaeologists are saying. Very long ears on the statues, and that's also a kind of a Buddhist Indian thing. Buddha is always depicted with very, very long earlobes. So are many of the Hindu gods and whatnot. So back in the museum there, this is what the inlaid eyes are like. They were inlaid with ivory and then obsidian for the pupil. So when they put the statues around, the statues were alive. They thought they were alive. This power was coming out of the eyes that was protecting the island. This is a standard mythology of Easter Island. This is a very unusual statue there, and it's of a woman. It's a unique statue. No other statue on Easter Island is of this. Very strange head. We just, there's no real good explanation of just who this is. It's quite different than the other statues. Looks like some extraterrestrial or something like that in a way. Also in 1960, this statue was found, and it was also kept off display for decades. And it's only been, say, the last, I'd say 10 or 15 years that this has been on display. It is on display in the museum now. And it's an unusual looking statue too. It looks kind of like a gray alien head or something like that.
Maybe that's what all these balls are for.
Maybe. And yeah, and so again, apparently these balls were on Easter Island too. There are megalithic structures and with perfectly fitted blocks on Easter Island. It's called Vanapu. very similar to what we see in Peru and Bolivia and other places in the world. And even they get a little fancy where they like to put these little small but perfectly fitted granite little blocks in there. So now here's that unusual statue that's kneeling that was discovered by Thor Heyerdahl. And he's in a position known as Kuzuo. And the Kuzuo position is you're kneeling with your hands on your thighs, and often your head is forward a little bit. And it's an unusual position to be in, and it's known as the Kuzuo posture. And it's seen all over the world. Here we see it in ancient China. Here is the Kuzuo posture in Egypt. Here's a Kuzuo posture, also this is Shang Chinese, very ancient. He's got a mohawk haircut. The idea of the Kuzuo, now here we are at Tiwanaku, also in the Kuzuo position. The idea of Kuzuo, they're wearing turbans and stuff here too. The idea of Kuzuo is it's kind of a supplement type position in the sense that you're in front of a lord or somebody who's very important, so you get down on your knees and you sort of put your head forward because you're in front of somebody really, really important. This is an Olmec statue in Mexico. He's in the Kuzuo position. He's got the top knot on his head like Easter Island statues. The top knot is very, very long hair, like Vikings or something. The Shivites in India and Southeast Asia do that. And then you tie your hair in a big bun up on top of your head. This is another Kuzuo position. This is in Harappa, Indus Valley. So this is now very, very ancient India. And Robert was talking about this a little bit. This is the Rongo glyphs that are found on the Rongo tablets in Easter Island. And it was a Czechoslovakian archaeologist who noticed that the Rongo glyphs were virtually identical to the writing of the Indus Valley civilization in ancient India. This is, right where the border of Pakistan and India is today. It's known as the Sindh Desert. And neither of these writings, these scripts, have been decoded. Not the Indus Valley one or the Easter Island Rongo writing either. Rongo writing was written is what they call the Bostafidan pattern. One line is left to right, and the next line is right to left to right. They also call that as a writing as the ox plows. Hittite was written that way. Doric Greek was written that way, and probably the script of Indus Valley was written that way too. So here's a Rongo tablet. The A.R.E's kind of stick figures and whatnot. What a lot of people try to explain Rongo writing and the different figures, they are stick figures, but they have their hands and arms and legs in different positions. And that is known in ancient India and yoga and stuff as a mudra. So any way you position your arms, your hands, even the way you hold your fingers and all that, it all has meaning. And that's, sign language, like the Hawaiian sign language and all that. So in a mudra, the Mayans did the same thing. So even just the way you're holding your arm and your legs, it all has meaning. It's called a mudra. So, all right, now another really amazing Pacific Island ruins that most people have never heard of are a place called Namdal. And Namdal is on an island in Micronesia called Ponape. Giorgio and I were just there, filming an Ancient Aliens episode that's still to air. This place is the 8th wonder of the world. It's actually out in the ocean. It's got walls 40 feet high, stacked up prismatic basalt. This is the same kind of basalt as Gunung Padang in Indonesia. But here, it's actually stacked up into 100 artificial islands. Much of it's in the ocean. A lot of the city is underwater. Archaeologists estimate that there's over 250 million tons of basalt in this city. Okay, and it's a canal city. And the islanders say that all of this material, blocks of basalt weighing up to 80 tons, was flown across the island from the other side of the island. 250 million tons of basalt. stacked up into 100 artificial islands like this, sea walls and huge walls. I mean, it's astonishing. This place is the 8th wonder of the world. And when you're there, you can believe that, yeah, they did levitate all these stones, just flew them through the air. That is what the islanders all say. It's well known on the island. This is their explanation. And archaeologists are saying, oh, well, yeah, sure. No, but what you guys really did was just put these giant basalt logs on a canoe and float them around the island and then stack them up. I mean, of course they had to do it like that, right? And when you're there, you're like, wow, flying these things through the air and magically. They say 2 brothers came and did this, just flew all of these blocks through the air. It's astonishing. And in fact, you need a boat really to go through this thing. Much of it's underwater right now. It is kind of a canal city. It's astonishing. It's not a place, tourists don't really go to this island much. It's near New Guinea. It doesn't have beaches. There's a mangrove swamp like completely around the island. So it doesn't get a lot of tourists and whatnot. And there is stuff underwater for sure. So anyway, it's an amazing place. I've been here 5 or 6 times, and we were just there a couple of months ago. What the islanders say is that the basalt came from this mountain here, or at least some of it. There's 250 million tons of basalt there, and entire mountains would be dismantled for that much material. There's just so much material in this. And so they're saying that it came from this mountain, which they call Chicken Shit Mountain. That's the name of it. And yeah, it's a basalt plug, and it has the prismatic basalt. But just removing the basalt from these plugs and then getting it from the other side of the island to Namadol, I mean, it's astonishing. It's mind-boggling when you're there. And archaeologists, again, you don't see this much because this is not easy for archaeologists to explain. I mean, this is one of those sites where archaeologists pretty much admit, we're baffled by this, but they don't want to admit that. So again, they just don't talk about it. That's the best thing. All right, so cone heads, yep, they're out there, and so if you go to South America, actually, you're going to see a lot of cone heads. Cone heads were cranial deformation. This was something that went on all over the world. The Kurds doing it. Vanuatu, there are places like Vanuatu and Kurdistan and in Africa where people were still doing this right up until modern times. These guys in South America, these are in Paracas, near Ica, it's all south of Lima. Very, very dry area, and that's why there's a preserve. These skeletons are well preserved. It's just super duper dry there. Here's one of these guys. I mean, some of these, their craniums are like twice as long as ours, and the idea too that in theory, your brain is somehow filling up this cavity. If it's and there are ways to manipulate young children. And before the plates in your head, I mean, we know that people did this. The Flathead Indians in Montana did this. But there's a lot of strange things. Why are people doing this? It was going on around the world. In Vanuatu, they explained that, well, we did this because this is what the gods look like, that kind of a thing. So we have to wonder if there was actually a race of people, possibly extraterrestrials, who actually looked like this naturally. And that's the big question, is whether there were actually, we know that some of these are just imitations. They're forcing this conehead look. But what happens with, and this skull particularly is unusual because your plates in your head eventually, as you become 6 or 7 years old or something, as you get older, they fuse. And even though you're a conehead, they're going to fuse up there. But what's going on with this guy, he does not have this fusing of the plates in his head, and that's unusual. So it's possible that of all of these unusual skulls, that this one really is somebody who naturally is genetically a conehead, and perhaps this is what the extraterrestrials look like. I mean, that's certainly Ancient Aliens goes along with that. But this is a real skull. And there's many of, there's in South America particularly, there's a lot of these. Many, they're in Mexico too, they were in Malta. Certain museums have started to remove these from display, maybe because of the Ancient Aliens show. Because, they're becoming, more popular, and people go to these museums and they, like, whoa, look at these cone heads, and then the museums are like, whoa, get that out off display. So the idea whether there were actually children and infants who already looked like this with cone heads, that's a big question. And so in my book, The Enigma of Cranial Deformation, we talk about that. This is one actually from northern Mexico. This is a fairly recent discovery, only about 10 years ago, right in Sonora, near Arizona, actually. And so, yeah, he's a conehead. The Olmecs did all that. They were pretty much coneheads, of Mayans too, for that matter. This is a Chinook Indian from the Seattle area. They were coneheads. I went to a high school in Missoula, Montana, and just north of Missoula is the Flathead Lake. It's the largest freshwater lake west of Mississippi. And it's Flathead Lake. It's named after the Flathead Indians, and the Flathead Indians were named because they were coneheads, basically. So here we go. Even in apparently the Philistines, this is also something in the Middle East of these guys, coneheads and stuff. So yeah, the Goliath, apparently from David and Goliath. Yeah, he was a conehead. And this is Meritaten, one of the daughters of Akhenaten and Nefertiti, and she's a conehead too. Tutankhamun, he's a conehead. Although you don't, even though they talk about Tutankhamun all the time, they never mention that, yeah, he has a elongated skull. So with the Anunnaki and ancient Sumeria, and you remember those serpents on the towers and stuff in Peru, and also the Yazidi temples. Well, that's the northern part of Sumeria. And these are what are known as Ubaid figures. They're from a town, northern Iraq, called Ubaid, an archaeological excavation site. So he's a conehead too, and they have, this is in theory, Anunnaki, and they have what archaeologists call the coffee bean eyes. The eyes, is kind of strange eyes, and in mainstream archaeology, we call these coffee bean eyes. They're totally real, these statues. There's no question about them. Once again, these are some of these figures. They have almost a kind of insectoid look to them. Strange eyes. They're cone heads. So the whole idea that, yeah, these guys are extraterrestrials, and it certainly may well be. In Sumeria and Assyria, you have all these seals. There's like a Assyrian seal. You have these guys up here. They're sitting in a winged disc. It's kind of a flying saucer, I guess you could say. And here are these guys. These are Anunnaki too. These hats, these strange hats they're wearing, that means they're Anunnaki. And mainstream archaeologists will tell you this. Yeah, you see any figure, whatever, they have these hats. They're talking about the Anunnaki. The one on the left, she's got wings. She's wearing a hat. She can fly. And so, yeah, the Anunnaki are able to fly. They fly around in airships and things like that. All right, so let's see how we're doing here. Check the old time. We're doing all right. Okay, so let's look at some UFO photos for a few minutes. Ward, Colorado in 1929, and just one of, this is not the earliest UFO photo, but it's an early one. And yeah, there's apparently a flying disc that's what's in the background of this photo. This one from March 20th, 1950, big, giant, tubular, cigar-shaped craft just hovering over New York City, and hundreds of thousands of people probably saw this that night. Here's a close-up of what it looks like. Huge, huge craft. Yeah, tubular, cigar-shaped craft here. Here's one from 1960, taken in Utah. It looks very much like the Adamski flying saucer, if you know the story of George Adamski and whatnot. That's an interesting one. And now here are these photos here taken by a submarine, U.S. submarine called the Trepang in March 1971. And these are some pretty astonishing photos you're about to see. These photos were apparently taken in 1971. but they were not really released until just a few years ago, and they were published in a magazine in Paris. And apparently they were leaked, these photos were leaked to this magazine about 8 years ago. And they were published in a magazine in Paris. So here's the first photo, and apparently it's taken from the periscopes of a submarine. This is happening in the North Atlantic, up near Iceland and Greenland. So in the first photo, we're seeing this huge craft. It's coming up, straight up, out of the water. And as it gets up out of the water, it's got all this steam and stuff around it. It's like there's a very strong electromagnetic field that's part of the craft. It's creating all this steam. The craft is now leveling out over the ocean. I mean, it's come up from underwater. I mean, these things are submarines and they're airships. And so now it's leveling out in front of the submarine, and all this steam and water vapor and stuff is coming off of it. Here's a close-up of it in color. It did have apparently windows along the side. It's still got a lot of cloud and vapor around it. This thing in the middle is actually the fold of the magazine. You know, it's like a double-page spread. So that's not part of the thing. I mean, we only have these photos from this French magazine. And then here's the craft as it just, you know, as the water came off, and it just sitting there hovering over the ocean. And then what happened right after that, here's the craft again, and then another craft then came out of the water after this. And it came up out of the craft. It was a smaller flying saucer, kind of triangular craft. It came out of the water as well, and it then flew off like that. So these are pretty astonishing photos. Ones apparently the U.S. Navy had. They kept them secret, and then they were leaked probably by a crew member to this French magazine about 2010. This is another unusual UFO event that's very well known in New Zealand, called the Kaikoura UFOs. And what happened here in this case is in 1978. Most people in America have never heard of this, but in New Zealand it's well known. There was a cargo flight that would go from Auckland in the North Island down to Christchurch in the South Island every night, and then it would fly down, and then it would fly back at night. And in 1978, almost like virtually every night for several weeks, they were being trailed by a UFO, basically a flying saucer, and it was at night. And this was happening every night. And it would just follow them down and then follow them back. And finally the crew on this, you know, they decided, you know, we need to get some film footage of this thing. Might as well. I mean, it's happening every night. So they put a camera crew on the cargo flight, and they took this film. And there's an unusual thing. So they're taking the film, the craft is following them. They're taking it. You can see it's actually kind of a round orb, I guess, and it's going along. And then there's this photo right here, and this is kind of unusual. So here's that photo. This is one frame of the movie film, which is 1/30th of a second. So the UFO knew it was being filmed, and in 1/30th of a second, it made this figure-8 loop. In a 1/30th of a second. And did that, and then it took off. So apparently it was, as far as we can tell, it was doing this on purpose, to be filmed and actually showing them, this is what we can do, you know, in our craft. And so that's pretty unusual. And you know, it's an astonishing photo in a way. More recently, just over Dayton, Ohio, which is also Wright-Patterson Airfield and Hangar 18. That's supposedly where they took the aliens from Roswell and all that to Wright-Patterson. So over Dayton in May of 2016, people noticed in broad daylight this strange sort of arrowhead craft just hovering in the sky over Dayton on an afternoon. And it kind of came down out of a cloud, and then it just hovered there. for like 20 minutes or something like that, and people got out and took photos of it, and then it disappeared. So you have to almost wonder, too, because it's right near a really major Air Force base, whether this is quite possibly one of our own craft, in fact, but it would be anti-gravity. And that's part of the thing with UFOs. They're not jets, they're not rockets, they're electric. They have anti-gravity, they can hover. It's a different kind of technology and propulsion. In 2011, in the Baltic Sea between Sweden and Finland, they found this thing on the floor of the ocean, was just resting there. And they did sonar and things like that on it, and they found this craft. Here it is. Looks like the Millennium Falcon from Star Wars. So we don't know. I mean, we're not sure what's going on there, but that's one of the things with these UFOs and stuff. They're not just spaceships and airships. They're submarines too. They go underwater. And that's one of the stories of Atlantis. I'm not sure if Edgar Cayce talks about this, but it was a very curious book that was written in the late 1800s in California called A Dweller on Two Planets. And that is the book about Mount Shasta that is so famous. Mount Shasta, that's the book that really, talked about Mount Shasta as a hollow mountain and a UFO base and stuff like that. And it talks about Valix, these Atlantean craft, which are also these cigar-shaped type airships. So, all right, now let's talk about Nikola Tesla, probably the greatest inventor who ever lived. He's the one who invented alternating currents, lighting this room, the whole world today. Tesla was a Serbo-Croatian who immigrated first to England and then to the United States. He worked for Edison for a while. He would just envision his inventions in the sky. He was a real visionary. He would even run these inventions just through his mind, whether they worked or not. He died during World War II, Tesla. He also was a champion of lighting things remotely, wireless transmission of power. We'll talk about that in a second. At his laboratory in New York City, and he had one in Colorado Springs at one time too. Here's Mark Twain in his laboratory. Tesla is kind of like a suppressed person, really. Most people don't learn about Tesla, although now with the Tesla car company and other things, people are learning more about Tesla. But for a long time, you go to school, and unless you were studying electrical engineering, you learn Otis invented the elevator, and Edison invented the phonograph or something, but you wouldn't learn about Tesla, even though his inventions they're like science fiction today. He went to Colorado Springs to do tests on his wireless transmission of power, and this started early on. He then had a big fire in his laboratory in New York City, and it destroyed many of his inventions and patents and all his notes and things, and he was very upset by that. One of his students was Guglielmo Marconi, who's often credited with inventing the radio and many other things. He was a genius too. Tesla has now gotten credit for actually inventing the radio rather than Marconi. But Marconi was a good guy. A lot of Tesla people don't like Marconi. They feel that he was like stealing Tesla's inventions or something. But one of the big differences between Marconi and Tesla was that Tesla was very much a man out of time. He never got married. He had various phobias. He was a terrible businessman. He couldn't really deal with money and things like that. And so he was often kind of semi-broke, even though he was this tremendous inventor. Marconi was totally different. Marconi was very socially adept. He was a good businessman. He created all kinds of multinational companies and was a millionaire. Marconi supposedly died in 1937, although there are books that came out in Italy and in Mexico and in Argentina. They were never really in English, but these books maintain that Marconi and a bunch of scientists faked their deaths in 1937, and Marconi wasn't that old. and that they all went to South America and they built a secret city down there, and with flying saucers and super technology and all this kind of stuff. I mean, it seems. And in fact, the film Moonraker, the James Bond movie, is kind of based on that. This idea of like a secret space base in South America and stuff. But our Marconi allegedly did that. And many Italians and South Americans believe that. So here we go, another great inventor and scientist, Einstein. So with Einstein, you know, he talked about relativity and all that kind of stuff. But one of the things that Einstein talked about was the unified field. And the unified field was the field in which gravity and magnetism and electricity all manifested from the unified field. That's what Einstein said. And he was supposedly writing a paper all about that, the unified field. Although we don't have it, it was never published. But just like we have equations for electromagnetism, there's an equation for that. But with the unified field, there would also be equations for electrogravity and magnetogravity. So within the unified field, yeah, you would have now a basis for gravity control, anti-gravity, which would also be levitation and stuff like that. So that's coming out of that. The whole idea, too, of also toroidal plasmas. Robert Chalk was talking about plasma twos as plasma is an electrified gas. He was talking about lightning strikes and things coming down out of the sun or whatever, plasmas. In this case, a plasma is, you can do a plasma like these lights where you have a mercury plasma. And there are ways of creating gyros with mercury and plasmas, toroidal physics type things. Smoke rings are like this. Just normal gyros are also anti-gravity. But when you use mercury, mercury is an element, it's a metal, it's a conductor, and it's a liquid. And mercury is poisonous too, and mercury gas or mercury plasma is also poisonous. You need it in a closed system. But the idea that you're using plasma gyros with mercury, and the whole thing is a toroid donut, the whole thing's spinning, it's electrified, it's going to be a bright light. So this is perhaps one way that some of these craft, and particularly the ancient craft, were being used. Tesla also created death rays and things like that. You don't hear too much about death rays anymore, but back in the 20s, death rays were a major topic. And Tesla was still very famous back then. Magazines were putting out Tesla's inventions and experiments and talking about it. And it was all like super science fiction. And if you see the old serials of the 20s and 30s with Flash Gordon and Buck Rogers and all these other guys, you know, they're flying around these electric buzzing airships and stuff like that. Everything was electric back then, and until World War II. Then after World War II, everything became rockets. So Tesla's death ray, there's different concepts of it. One was of a scalar wave weapon where you have these energy bottles and rays, and where they all converge, that's, you know, where everything's, you know, destroyed and stuff like that. So that's a scalar wave type weapon. Now, just recently, Princeton, it's about 5 years ago, they published a new book about Tesla with some of Tesla's papers that had never been patented or published before. And they had these unusual ones in there, and this is really a mercury death ray that Tesla invented. And what it is that you know, supercharged pellets of mercury are shooting out of these nozzles, and so it's like a little plasma charge that's like a bullet. And in fact, in the Star Wars movies, when they're firing their ray guns and the Star Wars troopers, they're shooting at each other with those little you know, orange shots and stuff. Yeah, it's like a charged, supercharged, you know, mercury bullet that's, say, whatever, a foot long, and it's super duper hot. But mercury is the core of it, and it's firing out, and yeah, it'll just, you know, melt a hole right through you and your spacesuit, and then go through the wall. So that was it. But I thought that was interesting that this is, Tesla was working on that too, and that's really the basis of, ray guns and stuff like that. So Tesla wanted to, his big thing at the end of his life was to create these towers. He wanted to set up a wireless transmission of power. And he invented that with these towers. He went to Colorado Springs to do experiments. And what he wanted to do was build these towers that would then have these anti-gravity craft with these powerful searchlights and things. These are illustrations from the 1920s. So here's his tower in work. You've got it's broadcasting power. It's these anti-gravity craft are picking up the power from these. Here they're all electric. They have these powerful searchlights and things like that on them. And the whole idea was, we're kind of using it today with Wi-Fi and stuff, but the whole concept is just like broadcasting radio or television, you can broadcast power. It's what they call longitudinal waves and things like that. And so here's how it would be. Rather, if I was going to put a lamp on this table, today we'd have to put a lamp on the table, and then I'd have to take the cord and find an outlet and plug it in over here. But with Tesla's wireless system, I would just put this lamp on the table, and then I would just turn it on. I wouldn't have to plug it in a wall or anything. It would just take the power. That's it. And today, with the cell towers and stuff, we're walking through a sea of energy every day as we just walk down the street. We're bombarded with cell tower energy, radio waves, radar, television waves, and we could have power waves that too. What happened in the end was that J.P. Morgan was funding Tesla, but as J.P. Morgan, and they were building the tower in Long Island. Here's another thing, the things, and there's actually fighting a war, and their battle airships are shooting down airplanes and stuff. So J.P. Morgan, the more he understood what Tesla was doing, and he realized, oh boy, but there was no way to meter the energy, the power. That was the problem. And so it was, in a sense, a free energy system where these towers would be out there, and they would just be broadcasting power all over the place. And what J.P. Morgan, if he wanted to make money out of it, he'd have to go into the lamp business and sell people lamps, and electrical devices. And he didn't want to do that. He wanted to be able to meter power and charge people for it, which is, of course, what we have today. And so they tore these towers down. They started to build one in Long Island at a place called Wardenclyffe. They got about 80% done building the tower, but J.P. Morgan pulled all the funding for it. And later the FBI came and tore that tower down. And then Tesla died in 1943 during World War II. And as some people think he was assassinated. There's stories of that. And that the Germans actually came and assassinated him in New York. So let's now go back to Atlantis, and we're going to go back to obelisks and things like that. So there was a group in California that came ultimately out of the Theosophical Society. They were called the Lemurian Fellowship. And they published the sequel to that book, A Dweller on Two Planets, about Mount Shasta, and it was called Earth Dweller Returns. And in that book, and the Dweller on Two Planets had also talked about this too, but they went into this. The second book went into more detail. They claimed that in Atlantis there was a tower called the Maxed Tower, and it was a tower very similar to what Tesla was doing, and it was broadcasting power into the atmosphere for Atlantis and the Atlantean airships and stuff like that. Would draw power from it, just like Tesla's tower, the whole thing. And this is what they claimed it looked like. So it had a base and everything, and it was a tall crystal tower that was very, very high, hundreds of feet high. And then you need a power station. You need to, it's not just generating power by itself. You need a power station, and then it's putting the power out. And it's like a TV antenna or one of Tesla's towers, and it's basically broadcasting power. Well, we have these things. They're called obelisks. So obelisks are essentially like that Max Tower of Atlantis. And the obelisks are monolithic crystals, in a sense. They're quartz. Obelisks should be made of granite, which is infused with tiny quartz crystals. And there's different kinds of granite with different size crystals in it, and they have different grades of granite. Aswan granite is said to be one of the finest. So yeah, many of the obelisks in Egypt, anyway, and they're not the only country with obelisks. They were quarried, erected in Egypt. A typical obelisk weighs about 500 tons or more. They're monolithic. They're not 2 or 3 pieces of stone. They're one solid piece of stone. They can't, like the unfinished obelisks, they can't have any cracks in it. They have to be perfect. They're tuned, like a tuning fork. They're a certain size. It was probably later that the Egyptian hieroglyphs were put on them. If you go to Luxor Temple or Karnak Temple in Luxor, they both have obelisks in them. Karnak particularly is like that. That temple had to be built around that obelisk. When the temple was built, there was no way they could have possibly moved that obelisk in and stood it up. So the obelisk had to be there first. And in Luxor, there's one that's fallen at Karnak, and there's one that's still standing. But those obelisks had to be there before the rest of those temples were built. So it's quite possible that Karnak Temple and Luxor Temple and any place where there was an obelisk, that the obelisk was already there, and then the dynastic Egyptians came and they built temples around it. So yeah, you have this. I mean, they're basically monolithic crystal towers, like the Max Tower, and in theory they could have broadcast power. And so once again, they're just so gigantically huge. This is the unfinished obelisk, again, just an old print from the 1800s. It's before they excavated and dug it all out to see what was there. It was just this huge, massive granite, monolith that's lying there. Here it is again today, the unfinished obelisk. It's trenches around it. It's still in the quarry. The trenches are very big around the side. Here's Christopher Dunn standing in the trench. So just quarrying this obelisk and then cutting underneath it, lifting it out. I mean, these are modern Egyptians couldn't do it today with all the equipment they've got in Egypt. Here's the Washington Monument being hit by lightning. So even today, and the Washington Monument is really a faux obelisk. It's not a real obelisk because it's not a monolith. There's stairs inside it. I mean, it's built out of many stones and stuff like that. But it's definitely it's a symbolic super obelisk, and it symbolizes the power of Washington D.C. today. And it looks great. When I see Wolf Blitzer, giving the news, and there's that giant obelisk behind him, it looks good. So here we go. And in fact, the largest obelisk ever known to have been erected was not in Egypt, but in Ethiopia. In Aksum in Ethiopia, there's a whole bunch of obelisks. Many are still standing in Ethiopia. They're still standing there today. They're also granite. And the largest obelisk is this one over here. It's the largest obelisk ever erected, and it weighed over 1,000 tons. It was in Aksum, which is in northern Ethiopia. And this obelisk was so huge that when it came crashing down and it landed on top of this other huge megalithic building there at Aksum, and even just pieces of this obelisk are gigantically huge. It's astounding when you're there. And even today, archaeologists are pretty amazed at wow, how they, again, quarried this obelisk. The quarry's not so far away, but it's still like 20 miles away or something like that. We went there. So yeah, you have obelisks also in Ethiopia. Here it is. This is part of it. It just came crashing down, broke into a whole bunch of pieces. And in fact, parts of it now are lying on this other huge slab, which they call the tomb of some guy or something, and but they don't know what's underneath it. And what even our Lonely Planet guide to Ethiopia said that what the legends are in Aksum is that underneath this other slab is this anti-gravity machine that was used to erect the obelisk. And I was like, wow, this is in the Lonely Planet book? I'm like, man. And actually, when Graham Hancock, in his great book, Sign and the Seal, which was, that book's from the mid-'80s or so, and he also goes to Aksum, and he's talking to a priest, and he's looking at these obelisks too, and he's just going like, wow, these are really big, how'd you guys erect all that? And the priest tells him, he said, oh, we couldn't do that. And he then tells him, oh, we had the Ark of the Covenant, and that's how we erected these obelisks. And, Graham was like, oh, really? Well, okay. And in fact, here's part of that obelisk, and this is this other building over here where the anti-gravity device is supposed to be. And there's also here at Aksum these same keystone cuts. Remember, we were looking at that, and the clamps and everything. So we're finding the same unusual technique, megalithic technique, in Peru and Bolivia and Vietnam. It's in Java. It's in Ethiopia. It's also in Egypt and other areas too. And there's monolithic doors there too in Aksum, like this. I mean, and just cutting a door out of a just giant slab of granite. And this is the church. It's also in Aksum. And Ethiopians believe that the Ark of the Covenant is in this building. That's what they think. Other people think it's probably a copy of the Ark of the Covenant. And I talk about all this and the obelisks and stuff in my book on Ark of God and the Ark of the Covenant. And I also talk about it in my book on obelisks as well. So it's the Ark of the Covenant in here. There's always one priest, and only he's allowed in there. He guards the Ark of the Covenant, and then when he's dying, he chooses another priest to take his place. And that guy lives just by himself in this little church there, St. Mary's Church. Well, other obelisks and standing stones that are like obelisks are in other places. These are the Devil's Arrows in Yorkshire in Great Britain. And they're basically obelisks too. Archaeologists do not know what they're doing there. They call them the Devil's Arrows. This is another one. This is near Scarborough in eastern Yorkshire. This is called the Rudston Monolith. They built a little church there, but it's also an obelisk. They put a little tin cap on it. So England's got obelisks as well. Here it is. There's obelisks also in other places too. Karnak in Brittany has a giant obelisk that's broken. I talk about all that in my book on obelisks. Now this is a really strange story here too. Back in the early 70s, Eric von Däniken came out with his book, Chariots of the Gods, big international bestseller, and I read it too. I thought it was great. And just a few years after that, what was another big bestseller was Charles Berlitz's book on the Bermuda Triangle. And that was a big seller. So after Berlitz's book on the Bermuda Triangle came out, there became all these other books about the Bermuda Triangle came out, there's dozens of them. And also a bunch of books about the Great Lakes Triangle. There's the Bermuda Triangle, but now and he wrote another book about the Dragon's Triangle, that's around Japan. So this book here, Gateway to Oblivion, by a Canadian, his name is Hugh Cochran, and it's all about mysteries of the Great Lakes and vortexes, disappearances, and stuff like that. Well, one of his chapters in the book is about this park in Ontario called Presqu'île Province Park, right up here. It's on the north shore of Lake Ontario. It's in Canada. And so what happened at Presqu'île Park was, and the story he's got in his book, is that in 1805, people from this park who lived right there, on a nice summer day, they would row their boat out into the lake, not too far from shore, and there was an obelisk coming up from the bottom of the lake, several feet high, and the very tip of the obelisk was sticking up out of the water. And people would, this is what he's saying in the book. It sounds fantastic. And people would row up to it, and they would moor their little rowboats to the tip of this obelisk that was just coming out of the water, and they'd have their Sunday picnic and whatnot, and then they would go back to shore. But then what happened was there was a big storm on the lake, and it was actually bringing a prisoner back towards Wellington, and it was apparently it was coming from this place, Newcastle, and it was going that way. And a big storm came up on the lake, and the people they knew the ship was coming and passing by, and they were afraid that it would hit the shore and stuff, and they lit a huge bonfire on the shore to try and help, signal the ship and direct it so it wouldn't run aground. Well, apparently the ship came in and it hit that obelisk and knocked it over, and the ship itself sank, and everyone drowned. And there was a big tempest and storm and stuff like that. And so at that point, the obelisk was gone. So I thought that was just such an amazing story. I was just like, wow, so maybe obelisks were all over the world. Supposedly there was an obelisk at Pumapunku too. And I found a German book where he talks about that. There being an obelisk. How are we doing here? All right, so we still got some time. All right, let's go to the moon. So here we go, the amazing moon. Well, guess what? There are obelisks on the moon, yes. And they're called the Blair Cuspids. Blair was a Boeing engineer in Seattle, and these are photos coming back from the early 60s moon missions, before we landed on the moon and whatnot. And what they showed were these obelisks on the moon. And this is actually a Russian diagram of them. So it's from the shadows and stuff like that that the obelisks are. So they're known as the Blair Cuspids, and they are apparently these obelisks on the moon. How about that? So and there's more than that. The moon itself is pretty mysterious. Even the orbit that it has around the Earth is very strange. It's almost too perfect, ultimately. NASA at one point said that the moon was older than the Earth and wasn't even from our solar system. I mean, it's not a twin companion to the Earth, as what they originally assumed. The moon itself is full of rare metals, titanium and chromium, and there's evidence that the moon is hollow. And during the Apollo missions, sometimes the parts of the spacecraft that crashed on the moon, and the moon, they said, rang like a bell for hours. And the idea that the moon itself is hollow. Certain people have said that there are craters on the moon that they can't find a bottom to, and that they might be entrances into really like a hollow moon. So in this case, our moon is almost like the Death Star from the Star Wars movies, like that, something artificial. One of the books that was written in the 70s about the moon was called Our Mysterious Spaceship Moon. And literally the moon is coming from another solar system and was brought here to Earth and placed into orbit around our planet. So one of the strange things too, the Russians, to their credit, were always more into science, and because the Soviet Union was officially an atheist country, and they wanted science, but they were always much more open to extraterrestrials, to life on other planets, to strange things on the moon. That wasn't such a forbidden topic in Russia. And so here, the Zond 3 was a probe also in the 60s, and this photo is showing what is apparently a 20-mile-high tower here on the moon. So there aren't just obelisks on the moon, apparently, but huge towers that are 20 miles high. And of course, NASA would know all about this too, and the other space programs. The Navy has their own space program, the Army has their own space program, and the Air Force presumably has their own space program too. In fact, was it last summer Trump announced he was going to put all of the at least three military space programs into one, the Space Command that he called it. But yeah, a lot of people don't know that. I mean, we have NASA. Everything that NASA does is public domain. Every photo they take is supposed to be public domain. Every discovery they make is supposedly public domain for us. But the Navy and the Army and they have their own space programs. And those space programs are top secret. The discoveries and the things they do, that's not public domain. Only what NASA does. So anyway, yeah, so here's another Zon 3 photo of a dome, supposedly. There's even things on the moon that look like ziggurats, stuff like that. Even other things that look like craft that are parked on the moon. Here's another photo of what seems to be a giant craft that's also kind of parked on the moon. It's a close-up of it. I mean, it's hard to know whether just how authentic all these photos and things are. Here's another kind of pyramid that's on the moon. Looking at these things from these photos, I mean, just like the Blair cuspids and these obelisks, it's the shadows that they cast. It's the way they can really look at these things. Here's another object on the moon. This is a Russian photo of the moon. Looks like some kind of Tesla type facility, kind of like an energy thing. Kind of looks like one of those plasma things that Robert Schoch was showing. So, these are all unusual things. Here's Mars. Let's go to Mars now. So, Mars has 2 moons. One of those moons is called Phobos. The other moon is called Deimos. They're quite small moons, and they orbit in opposite directions around the planet. And so here's the Phobos moon. Weird striations and craters and stuff like that on it. Even early on, and Carl Sagan even speculated that the Phobos and Deimos, the Martian moons, were quite likely artificial. He suggested that. And there's what's known as the monolith of Phobos. So on Phobos is also a monolith that's similar to an obelisk or something. It's a huge tower that casts this shadow. And in fact, John Lennon's son, Sean Lennon, actually has got a rock group, and it's called Monolith of Phobos. That's what it. So even these rock guys are into all this. Yeah. So here we are. Here's some other photos of what they think the monolith of Phobos is. So yeah, astronomers and astrophysicists, they're all interested in this. I mean, it's apparently a real thing, and no one can quite explain it. It would seem to possibly be an artificial structure. Here's the other moon, Deimos. It's kind of similar, small moon. And this is was a Russian cosmonaut, a woman named Maria Popovich. So in 1989, she went on television and newspaper in Russia and Europe, and they released this photo. So in 1989, the Russians had a space probe going to Mars, and this probe itself was called Phobos as well. So the Russian probe Phobos was headed for Mars, and as it approached Mars, it was approaching the Phobos moon. Suddenly, this huge elongated craft came into view. We'll do it that way. So yeah, this massive elongated craft came into view, and the Russians, they were turning the cameras. They were like, okay, we've got to get a picture of this. This was released by a Russian astronaut. And then the Phobos spacecraft, the Russian spacecraft called Phobos, it then turned its cameras towards Mars. And it photographed this thing coming at it from Mars, which was, we're not sure what this is, but apparently it was some energy shot that was aimed at the Russian probe Phobos and shot it out of orbit. And this is the last photo it took. So basically the Phobos went, looked and, whoa, something's coming at us. Bang, it hit the Phobos spacecraft and knocked it out. That was it. So other kind of weird stuff on Mars, different mechanical parts and things like that. There's pyramids on Mars. They call the D&M pyramids. There's a sphinx, supposedly, also in front of the pyramid. They say this is, all these Martian guys, other little structures and stuff, possibly on Mars. And there's even a monolith on Mars. They call this the Mars monolith. I mean, it's like the 2001 A Space Odyssey movie, where in that whole movie, they're going to the moon because they're looking at this monolith. And yeah, there's one on Mars that looks at that. You can look that up on the internet, Mars monolith. So look, I'm just going to wind it up here, and I guess my final little things I'll talk about is our solar system. So we have the planets coming out of the solar system, and back in the mid-1800s, there was a German mathematician named Bode. And Bode came out with a thing called Bode's Law. Bode's Law was like an algorithm of planets, and what Bode was saying was, well, as you go out from the sun, you're going to have a planet here, and as you go a little farther from the sun, you're going to have another planet here, and it's like a spacing of planets. And as astronomers got it together and figured out our solar system, what they found out was that our solar system actually fit Bode's Law very well. I mean, almost perfectly, except for one thing. And that was, what Bode said, was that between Mars and Jupiter, there should be a planet. But there's not a planet there. Instead, there's an asteroid belt. So the asteroid belt itself is all these rocks in space. But Bode was saying, yeah, there should be a planet there. And so the idea here is that there was a planet there, but that planet blew up. And now there's all these rocks in space. And that's the story of Superman. Remember, Superman is from the planet Krypton, and that planet blows up. But he escapes to Earth and grows up in Iowa. So here's one last little thing. Ceres, the largest body in the asteroid belt. This is the largest of all the bodies in the asteroid belt. And it has this like weird bright spot on it. And, astronomers, again, they're like, this is pretty unusual. They just call it a bright spot. But it's like it's being lit from the inside. And so, yeah, the idea, even today they want to go, and the Japanese have landed now. That's the thing, that they're trying to send these landers and stuff onto asteroids, which is pretty, that's a pretty good feat. So that's the whole idea. But the whole idea that, yes, the asteroid belt is the remains of a planet, and that the blowing up of that planet, we don't know what happened, of course. I mean, we have legends and things. But with that cataclysm, that may have been what sucked all the atmosphere, although Mars still has an atmosphere, and the water from Mars, and peppered the moon and other things with craters. I mean, it would have been a huge disaster. Some of them hit the Earth and stuff. And even, there's ideas that, we're from Mars, and that, people then escaped from Mars and came to Earth. I mean, who knows? So that is my presentation, everyone. Thank you for coming. I stopped just in time. So I talk about all this stuff in my various books on obelisks, on the Ark of God, on ancient technology in Peru and Bolivia, and whatever. So I hope you'll buy some of my books at some point, and it's been great to be here. And so thanks. I don't know if we have time for maybe a question or two. I know many of you have to go. Yes, ma'am.
Is it a true obelisk if it doesn't have the pyramid shape on top?
Yeah, she's asking if it's a true obelisk but it doesn't have the shape on top. That's called a pyramidion, which is the pyramid-type shape at the top. That's a good question. I think in a way that an obelisk does have to have that point, the pyramidion, yeah. So that makes the monolith of Phobos doesn't have that. It's flat top, yeah. Yes, sir?
I had a question about the stone ball that you showed in Easter Island. It looked like the stone was different. Almost everything I've seen pictures of on Easter Island looks very lava-like, volcanic, and that looked more like marble or something.
Yeah, it's granite, and there's a lot of things are granite.
Are they?
Yeah, there's a lot of obsidian on Easter Island. Not so much basalt,
Okay.
but yeah, granite and
Okay.
there's a lot of lava flows, and yeah, it's
Okay.
a
And then-
volcanic island, essentially.
And then on the back of one of those moai, it looked like there was some carvings on the back of it.
There are. I didn't show those. Yeah, it looks like an ankh actually, and yeah, he's wearing kind of a belt
Yeah,
and stuff.
okay.
Yeah, those. I didn't talk about that, but in my book on the calm, what I say those Easter Island statues are, they're statues of Shiva, the Hindu god Shiva. That's what those statues are of. That's what I maintain, and that's because they have the top knot. Shiva. That's a Shivite. Normal Hindus, normally male. A Hindu would shave their head completely bald, but they would leave a small tail in the back called a sika. And in fact, remember the Hare Krishnas used to be in the 70s and the 60s, 70s stuff, and they would have that little tassel. That's called a sika, and they would shave their heads. Most Hindu males would do that. Today, not so much because they just wear their hair normally. But in the past, yeah, they all shaved their heads, except for one sect of Hindus, and they were called Shivites. And they did not shave their heads. They grew their hair long down to their waist, and they tied it in a bun on top of their head. And that's what those statues have. They have they have a top knot thing. That's a separate thing. Shiva, part of the Hindu trinity, Shiva lives in Tibet on Mount Kailash. Okay, the Hindu god. He carries a trident and all that. And he has blue skin. He's maybe a conehead too. But in my book on the cam, that's what I say, that those Easter Island statues, they're all statues of Shiva. Time for maybe one more question or something. Yes, ma'am.
Can you tell us anything about an upcoming project or two?
Well, yeah, I'm on the Ancient Alien show, which is still going. There are new episodes coming out. It'll be going at least another year or so. So, I mean, I'll be doing stuff with them. And that Nan Madol, that city in the Pacific, that's an upcoming episode of Ancient Aliens. Yeah. Yes, ma'am, or let's over here. I don't want to run over. I think I have 3 more minutes.
Yeah, I was wondering, do you have any plans or have you been to the giant megaliths in the Altai Mountains in Siberia and also Montana?
I've seen photos. I've not been to either of those, although I went to high school and college in Montana. I'd like to see those ones in Montana. I've seen photos of those. They'll look interesting. Yeah,
I have
don't
a
know.
contact for you.
And then there's those ones in Siberia too. It's hard to tell whether they're, man-made or, sometimes people think that natural sites are man-made. Until I'm there and see them myself, I can't say.
Yeah, in Montana, they've done ground-penetrating radar studies. Julie Ryder has done a lot of research on it with some other scientists and so forth.
I've seen some of those photos, but yeah, they look really interesting. Yeah, I wouldn't mind. I'd like to see that.
Okay.
Yeah, thanks. And okay, there's a lady in the back here.
I just want to let you know, October 25th of this year, Cayce is going to release the Tesla movie called The Current War.
Yeah, that's right. That's just coming out, a movie about Tesla. That's great. And unfortunately, Tesla's finally getting his due as he should. And what Tesla did, he did things that were still science fiction today, and that's why he's suppressed, because, we're supposed to have rockets and jets, but Tesla had a whole nother technology. So this kind of electric anti-gravity stuff, it goes back to before World War II. Yeah, you had a question, ma'am.
I was just wondering if you could make a comment, wanted to hear your thoughts on the new policy for the Navy of reporting.
Yeah, that's good. That's good that they're doing that, for sure. More and more, these subjects that we're all so interested in and that A.R.E. has promoted, for decades, and other people too, are finally, coming to popular attention. And the military has known about all this stuff, I believe, for a long time, and they're intensely interested in this too. But they do keep a lot of it a secret. But now it's starting to come out, and that's what we all want, of course. Yes, sir.
Okay, 2 questions.
Yes, ma'am.
On the stone balls in New Zealand.
Yeah.
In the ocean.
Yeah.
Are they actually round on the bottom?
Yeah, I believe so.
They're spherical.
Yeah.
Okay. And the other question was, you said that on Easter Island the inlaid eyes are obsidian and ivory.
Yeah, whale ivory.
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
That was my
yeah, well,
question.
yeah. So that's the white, and then the obsidian pupil was put in it. Yeah.
How on earth do they catch the whales?
Oh, in the ocean. Yeah.
How? I mean,
Oh,
whales are big.
just like Eskimos catch whales and stuff. Yeah, you know, people go out and catch whales.
Thank you.
Yeah. Sometimes they can even just be beached, you know, on the island or something.
Thank you.
I'm sure the ivory was quite valuable to them, you know. But yeah, they did a lot of fishing there. I mean, Easter Island is one of the most remote islands in the world. The Hawaiian Islands, too, by the way, are also a very remote island group. Hawaiian Islands are thousands of miles from anywhere, and so is Easter Island. Yeah. Okay, one last question. Yes, ma'am.
When I was looking at your photos on the towers and stuff, makes me think of the 5G networks that
5G
are coming
network
out.
is coming out, right? Yeah, that's right. And that's what I was talking about too. I mean, with the 5G network, there'll be even more towers everywhere and more energy in the atmosphere. So with radar and television and now these wireless networks, you know, we are bombarded by electromagnetic energy everywhere we go. And if you're living in a city, if you're living in the countryside or in some small town, the 5G network probably won't affect you, or you won't even really be part of it. But if you're living in a major city and they have the 5G network there, yeah, you're almost twice as much electromagnetic energy. And that's not really good for you. And that was one of the early criticisms of Tesla's wireless system, was that, yeah, having all this power in the atmosphere, which now we already have, is bad for your health in theory. And you know, they've often said you shouldn't live under power lines. You don't want to be near strong electromagnetic fields. They're, you know, it's bad for you. And supposedly people who went into these like pyramid energy centers and stuff like that, to protect themselves, they would wear these metal helmets and stuff like that to protect your brain from all that energy. And I mean, even in Atlantean times, you could get brain cancer, I guess. Good. Thanks, everybody, and thanks to A.R.E. Thanks for coming.